I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the doctoral school on border studies at intersections of subject boundaries here at the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin. During the last 1.5 years, we got much used to participate at online events due to the overall sanitary situation. And this doctoral school in particular suffered from this situation as it had to be postponed several times. Against this background, I'm very much delighted that the doctoral school takes finally place, and I'm delighted to see so many faces, to read the rich program for the next days, and to know for sure that the discussions of your dissertation projects will take place in the buildings of the Humboldt University and in the Salle Thélion of the Centre. The subject of the doctoral school fits perfectly with the research that is carried out at the Centre for nearly 30 years by now. The Centre is an interdisciplinary research institute in the social sciences dedicated to understanding the social, political, and cultural dynamics which constitute Europe as an ensemble of intersecting groups and societies, as a complex assemblage of transregional connections, or as a space of permanently shifting geographical, political, administrative, legal, social, or cultural boundaries. Analyzing Europe from the perspective of the making of its multiple boundaries means to shift attention to the multi-level character of these processes. Also, it directs our attention to the contribution of academic research to the construction of European societies, and it directs our attention to the people themselves and the way how they contribute to and deal with the permanent negotiation of boundary making. The doctoral school has been organized in close cooperation with the research focus on mobilities, migrations, and reconfigurations of spaces at the Centre. There, we have a rich tradition of inquiring into the temporal, social, and spatial dimensions of change. But many presentations, which we will discuss within the next days, also have strong connections with other research focuses of the Centre. For example, with the one of the impact of political conflicts on legal and bureaucratic norms, with the one on the dynamics and experiences of globalization and their impact, globalization experiences and their impact on forms of life and epistemic objects, or with a research focus on conceptual approaches in research in the social sciences. Being aware of the many intersections of this doctoral school with the ongoing research at the Centre, it is really a great pleasure for us to host this event and to learn more about your projects and your approaches, how to describe and analyze European societies from the perspective of its subject boundaries. My special thanks go to the organizers of this event on the part of the Centre Marc Bloch, Pierrine Robin, Paula Seidel, Lucie Lamy, Joara Berian, and Nicolas Tietze. It is so great that you stuck to the project despite the really unruly circumstances, and congratulations that we can open the doctoral school today. Also, my warm thanks go to our cooperation partners. This is Christian Voss from the Department for South Slavic Studies. So thanks very much for your cooperation, which enabled us, among many other things, to meet in the main building of the Humboldt University tomorrow. And I would also like to thank the Interdisciplinary Center for European Studies of the Europa-Universität Flensburg for its support in organizing this event. And finally, my thanks go to the most important person this evening, namely to Béatrice von Hirschhausen, our keynote speaker, for having agreed to share her thoughts on the issue with us. Well, I wish us all inspiring presentations and debates during the next 2.5 days, and I hand over to Christian Voss, who is going to present the keynote speaker.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, on behalf of Humboldt University, let me also give you a warm welcome. Our university in 2012 celebrated its 200th anniversary and is a relatively young university. It's connotated with many Nobel Prizes and big names like Albert Einstein, Robert Koch, Max Planck, Helmholtz, or the Humboldt brothers themselves. After 13 years of Nazi barbarism and then 4 decades of forced Sovietization, Humboldt University since 1999 has seen a very dynamic transition and today is one of Germany's best performing universities and belongs to the elitist group of excellence universities. We are part of the Berlin University Alliance with Free and Technical University and Charité, and we are part of the Circle U University Consortium, where Université de Paris is also included. Being Humboldt, we hold the copyright of innovative teaching and the inseparable unit of teaching and research. Being Berlin, we are the metonymic symbol for the wall and the Iron Curtain, which had cut through Berlin, Germany, and Europe. In Berlin, you still can see the violence border regimes are exerting on the citizens, but our city can also tell lots of stories about subversive resistance against the war. Berlin is also a symbol for reopening and overcoming borders. Today, with the emerging right-wing movement, especially in the East, we start to reflect on the social costs of the internal colonization process we called reunification. My thanks goes to the Centre Marc Bloch and the organizers of this conference, Pierrine, Joara, Lucie, Paula, and Nicola, for initiating this conference. And I can remember well when you showed up for the first time at my office in November 2019, decades ago, you know, pre-corona time, to discuss this event. I'm representing South Slavic studies here in Berlin, and I'm interested in the former Yugoslavia and in general in minority issues in the Balkans. Our program is addressing intersections of subject boundaries, and this way develops further the concept of borders, boundaries, and or frontiers. I'm very glad to present you our keynote speaker, a designated expert in the field, Béatrice von Hirschhausen, who has contributed a lot to make border research in Berlin and the region more visible. She will speak about the heuristic interest of the concept of phantom borders in the understanding of cultural regionalization. Béatrice was project leader and principal investigator in the collaborative research center Phantom Borders in Eastern Central Europe between 2011 and 17, financed by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, BMBF. Since 1999, she's affiliated in different ways with the Centre here in Berlin, herself being Directrice de Recherche at the CNRS in Paris since 2018. She has extensively published on Romania, rural space, symbolic geography, and mental maps, memory studies, border studies, and last but not least, the German reunification. Among others, she actually is project leader of A Still Divided Sky. This is an allusion to Christoph Wolff's famous novel, Germany's East and West, 30 years after the reunification. Thanks again to the organization team. Thanks a lot to the Centre Marc Bloch for hosting us. And thanks to my faculty at Humboldt University and the Centre for the generous funding of this event. And before I give the floor to Béatrice, I would like to stress that tomorrow we will not meet in the main building of my university, since Humboldt canceled the rooms for conferences, and we are not able to be in another location tomorrow. I'm very sorry. If you find time and nice weather, have a walk around the university and take some pictures, but unfortunately we can't have a panel inside. I wish you a wonderful time here in Berlin and a fruitful and inspiring workshop. Thank you.
Alors, je vous propose de réfléchir à cette question des frontières qui nous réunit tous ici.
I would like to ask you to, first of all, think of the border issue, and this taking the vantage point of a specific concept, which is the concept of phantom borders. And this is especially interesting when you work on different forms of borders, also in the metaphorical sense. I will start out with a question which might be a little bit away from your own question, but this will then lead to the general reflection on how borders are created. The first question we will start off with is to speak about the differences between cultural spaces, or putting this differently, in how far cultural regions, entities, territories, in how far are these cultural regions significant in order to describe differences between different societies? And if they are significant, what status is granted to them in our research? What does this mean when we say, for example, we work on the Balkans, on Central Europe, or on the Maghreb, on Galicia, on the Mezzogiorno? What does this mean for our own research? Does this deliver another layer, a significant layer, in order to understand the concept of societies? So for a long time, this seemed to be kind of a very clear-cut concept, and one that was based on a consensus. A cultural region or cultural space was based on a superior level of the description of the world, one that has reference to history, and this throughout different centuries, and this from a starting point when a certain cultural system was crystallized on a specific territory. And then this was reproduced in the long term throughout civilizational efforts, and that was then stabilized through the transmission of institutions, of social norms and cultural institutions. So according to this concept, cultural region or space existed in itself before it was even identified by geographical or historical scholars. And since the beginning of the 1990s, there was some kind of discomfort which became apparent, that is for more than 30 years almost. And this had to do with the perception of geocultural differences, which really did not find any solution, or there was no solution for this crisis of different schools of thought on geocultural differences. So I would like to try and explain the following. First of all, let me describe the debate, first of all, in a rather schematic way. And then we will have a first example of a phantom border. And then there will be another example that I will show to you. And we will see that these borders can be delimiting different heritages, but also different visions for the future. And then we will speak about general conclusions to draw from the creation of borders in that way. So first of all, let me speak about cultural spaces and the debate surrounding them. The calling into question, directly or indirectly, of cultural regionalizations, be this, for example, the Far East or the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa, first of all, came about because of the criticism of post-colonial studies, and this in the wake of Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism in 1978, and he was excusing the Oriental scholars or Orientalist scholars to have dramatized the difference between Oriental, the West and the East, rather, in order to legitimize the European supremacy. And ever since, there were a number of publications that were trying to deconstruct all these regionalized science or scholarly efforts, and this according to different cultural regions. They demonstrated that there was an ideological dimension to them, which was focused on the West, and they also showed that there were also differences that were oversimplified between cultures, and they were also doing some research in the field of mental maps. So that had to do with geographical imaginaries. They also tried to find out whether these imaginaries, geographical imaginaries, also had to do with the reproduction of this kind of research. So there were values and judgments maybe that were also implicit in these regionalized research efforts, and they might have been further disseminated through that. And these days we have a whole general historiographical research that was analyzing the differences of cultural spaces. First of all, let me mention the works on Eastern Europe by Larry Wolff, and also the invention of the Balkans, Maria Todova from 1997. Also the publication on the invention of the Mediterranean, Florence Després, and then the Far East and its invention, and also even the continents, because the continents themselves are also constructions developed by researchers and scholars that are more or less artificial. So there are so-called meta-geographies, and they organize geographical knowledge as well as the representation of the world. So this historicization was breaking with a naturalized interpretation of the differences between cultural spaces, and also introduced a critical distance between the regional objects and their representation. So this showed all the forms of representation which sometimes were arbitrary, and they would also lead to the production of this knowledge, and through this put into context their significance. But we also have to say that this was a legitimate finding. Of course, this was something which did not come without paradoxes. Of course, there were different multiple deconstructions, but the cultural spaces still continue to structure themselves in different shapes, sometimes through the very common representation of the world, and also through the knowledge of scientists and scholars. And when it comes to the daily representation of the world, there is a general sense of our imaginaries which is imposed by them, of our imaginaries with regard to the differences between our societies. And very often these are not very much called into question in the daily representations and common representations of our imaginaries. And also they continue to organize a part of the scientific landscape, and also identify the different fields of knowledge and research. For example, we speak about the Center of Balkan Studies, or the professorships on Latin American history, or the scientific journal on Slavonic studies. So there is a whole academic world which is based on this delimitation of the world. So this is one of the paradoxes. So we kind of chased these cultural spaces out of the door, but they came back through the window through the research practices and also scientific and political practices of their institutions. And these cultural spaces, therefore, returned through scientific practices, sometimes for very practical and pragmatic reasons. Sometimes it has to do with linguistic competences, as well as and also the knowledge in the cultural domain, in order to be able to really produce focalized and localized knowledge. And this is why the regional centers of regional spaces and cultural spaces were very much important. And also it was important to trace borders, to trace respective limits, and also then delimit the knowledge based on those different divisions and borders. And this, of course, by taking into account, by recognizing the differences and the particularities of societies and their inscription in space. First of all, through And because of the reason of linguistic access to sources and empirical materials, and also sometimes there were transdisciplinary alliances that were of a heuristic significance between specialists of the Indian subcontinent or Latin America. And this means that through this division, this was then kind of further continuing the research practices, that is the practices of delimiting and dividing the world, even though we tried to chase those away, at least theoretically. That means this led to a sort of discontent. And the question is, how can we actually distinguish and delineate? And what does this do to societies when they belong to different cultural spheres? So in order to illustrate this problem, let me now take the example of a controversy which took place around the years 2000, and Christian is very much aware of this controversy. These were two specialists of Balkan Europe, and they were opposed in different ways. They had either the structural or the deconstructivist approach to think of the differences between two historical regions in Europe. A controversy which opposed the historian Holm Zundhausen. He is a very recognized and appreciated historian for the Southeastern Europe. Research effects and research efforts. And then we have Maria Todorova, who is a specialist in the history of Southeastern Europe, who is Bulgarian and American. And there was a big journal where there was a publication, which is Geschichte und Gesellschaft, and there was a book published by Maria Todorova in the United States. This was published in 1997, and it was entitled Imagining the Balkans. And in her very scholarly publication, she is exploring the historical process of construction and production with publishers, with writers, with travelers, and of course, in the political discourse of the regional entity of the Balkans. And she describes the progressive development of a region which is entitled the Balkans from the end of the 18th century, and this through an Ottoman reflux, that is, that they withdrew from the peninsula progressively. And therefore, this concept of the Balkans was then consolidated in the course of the 19th century and crystallized at the turning from the 19th to the 20th century. And this based on the stereotypes that were charged with negative values and which she calls Balkanism. And through this, there was a diffusion of the Balkanist rhetoric. And this was institutionalizing the societies of the peninsula as some kind of different Europe, a Europe which is stigmatized and which is lacking something. She criticizes the difference which was established between Central Europe, this kind of small replica of the West, and she is reproaching authors like Milan Kundera or Czeslaw Milosz to have complied with this through their support of Central Europe, complied with the negative images of the differences between Southeastern Europe and Central Europe. And I would simply like to show you by way of example, and I hope that this works. There we go. So here I can show you a map. This was created by William Wallace in 1990. And it draws a very clear line, a very clear border, which is based on a history that can also be reconstituted very well between the Europe of Occidental, of Western Christianity, which is in the West. This is the Catholic and Protestant Christianity. And then we have this line which goes from the north to the south of Europe. And on the other side of that line, we have the Orthodox Christians and the Muslim religion in Europe. And this border is in line with the border of the Cyrillic and Latin alphabets. So this goes back to a very ancient history, the great schism between the West and the East of Europe. So with regard to Western Europe and Central Europe, Balkan Europe, in this concept is characterized by its delay or backwardedness and its conflicts, which are also violent and which are also ethno-linguistic conflicts. And she also calls into question the works of scholars on the history of the Balkans, because she is suspecting them of legitimizing the same set of stereotypes that you also find in the common representations of the Balkans, or the Balkanist representations. So these publications, this book of hers was kind of especially provoking Hirschhausen. He was and is a historian who is very well recognized and who's publicized quite a number of scientific works on the Yugoslav region and the Balkans in general. So he is the second protagonist of our controversy. He is a specialist of Yugoslav societies, and he also was a very important actor of the deconstruction of the ethnic linguistic arguments that were shaping the war in Yugoslavia. So we cannot accuse him of trying to essentialize the cultures. He is very much aware of the construction of cultural identities, and he wrote a lot about them. But he was replying to Maria Todova, and he was trying to establish specific characteristics which he believed were very descriptive of these societies in that space. And this without negating and denying the historic dimension and the constructed dimension, but he identified clusters of characteristics, 8 characteristics that were very typical of the societies in the Balkan space. And he was attributing these characteristics to the history, the regional history of that region. He said that this historical space was a relational and structural space, and he said that this was not something which was irrefutable or fixed forever, but he said that these were criteria that were defining the space and also limiting, identifying the space, and also the foundations of a region and the Orthodox Byzantine heritages and the Ottoman Islamic heritages, that they were kind of shaping the political structures, the economic and cultural structures that differentiated this region from the remaining space of Europe. So there is an entire dialogue which is then taking place between those 2 authors in the wake of the article in that scientific journal, and the response of Maria Todova was contesting the possibility of such a structuralist approach, and was also contributing to exoticizing the Balkans and essentializing the differences. And this is why there was this vantage point to normality, which was mainly dominated by the West and the center of Europe. So she was accusing Mr. Hirschhausen of participating in a mental mapping exercise, or Balkanism, invented by the public and political spheres of the end of the 19th century. So at the end of the day, this is a dispute without resolution, because one was more interested in the imaginaries associated with the region, and the other discourse was focusing on identifying specific characteristics of societies in that region. Everybody remained in their position, and this was an open question which was never resolved. So at the end of the day, everybody was obliged to take sides, and either was then named a structuralist or a constructivist, even though I think that neither of the 2 positions can really fully explain the question of differences and specific characteristics of the region of the Balkans, even though this is something that we need to try to resolve. And this is why I was speaking of discontent. And this is why I would also like to highlight why it is so important to speak about the concept of phantom borders and why there is a heuristic interest in this concept. I will come to the second part of my presentation, and I would like to show you a first example. So could you just come to the next slide? The work on the phantom borders is the work of a project that was mentioned by Christian Voss. And it is the collaboration of a project with historians. So I worked with Hannes von Dietz, Dietmar Müller, and other historians, as well as geographers, Sabine von Löwes. She worked a lot on Ukraine, and Michael Esch. So all of these people contributed to this collective project. And then I was publishing this according to my own considerations. So for a moment, we will leave the Balkans and now go to Poland, and there we will look at electoral maps. And this is something that you can see on the next slide. So this is a map of the voting results in Poland, and I will show you why this is so important without entering into details. This is the map of the election results, last results. In 2020, Andrzej Duda, the presidential candidate, was elected with more than 43% of the first round of elections. So in blue, you see the territories that voted for Duda, and they are overrepresented by comparison to the average. And in red, we have those that voted for the two main competitors, and that retain the essential of the votes cast. So you see an extreme polarization between the different areas. First of all, there is a polarization between the cities and the rural areas. So you can see quite a number of dots that represent the big cities and that are in red. And then there is also the big divide between the west and the east of that territory. The opposition or divide between the east and the west is very important because it is kind of tracing borders that were dividing the Polish territory before, because before there were three major empires, and you can see this on the next map. So we have the map of the 19th century, the territory of Poland, which is divided into the German Empire in the west, the Russian Empire in the east, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in the south. So for Poland, this had major implications, which you can see on the next slide. Here you see the elections for 2010 with exactly the same scheme, the same concept of the divide of the opposition. And here again, you can trace the border, the Russian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, which is delimited by this imaginary border. So here you can see the history. We had the situation before 1914, the division between three empires, then the situation in the interwar period, the Second Republic of Poland, and the current map after World War II. And if you can look at the next slide, you will also see the territorial puzzle of contemporary Poland, which is now composed of all those different territories. And this is something which is then exemplified by the next slide. So very frequently, these differences are interpreted as being a geography of mindsets or mentalities, as if it was a heritage of the past, a burden of the past. And very often the analyses rely on a causality which is more of a cultural nature. And this is also what you could call cultural concepts that dominate and that construct an opposition between the East and the West. And this is then articulated because or based on the heritage of the different empires. And then the analysis of these maps, very often what is considered is that the different histories is then transferred to the political and cultural customs and traditions of the region. And this is why we have the pro-European vote in red, the vote for the opposition, the opposing candidates to Duda. And culturally, they would be more liberal in the respective constituencies. So that would be on the former German territory. And this would then go hand in hand with a more European, more West inclining attitude. And then we have the anti-European vote, very conservative vote of the territories of the former Greater Poland of the East, which is called Congress Poland, which was back then dominated by Russia. And that was then contributing to a heritage of a Russian civilization, which would be more inclined to autocrats and to provincialism. So these interpretations would classically assume that certain indicators of prosperity and development, economic development, would equal with progress and specific mindsets in the present day. Of course, this interpretation goes hand in hand with quite a number of problems, and one problem which I would like to explain is that these are phantom-like historical traces. This means that they are kind of very unstable on the maps. If we compare this map from 2020, the last presidential elections, I would like to show you another map, which was based on the first round of elections in 2000, that is 20 years before. And there you can see that the situation is entirely different. And I will show you how this is different if you cannot tell immediately. This map shows to you that the Poles made a political choice which was completely the contrary. So back then, they were re-electing their outgoing president, and this again in the first round of the vote with 54.1%. And this time they were voting for Alexander Kwasniewski. I hope that the pronunciation is correct of that last name. And this was a personality which was not on the right of the political spectrum, but on the left of the political spectrum of the time. And he came from the ranks of the former Communist Party. He even had official functions that he occupied in the People's Republic of Poland. So his success of Kwasniewski was especially remarkable in the so-called Western territories. And you can see this, that the Western territories in 2020 were massively voting for the liberal parties. But here, by contrast, they were voting for a candidate who was identified with the left, with the communist left. And therefore, the territories of the West were therefore tending towards a liberal political choice back then, but this time they were opting for a halt to the development towards a liberal modernity. And this was again different from the urban vote, because many urbanites were voting for his principal adversary, which was Mr. Oleszowski. He was an economist and he was more in the center-right camp. He was a former minister under the presidency of Lech Walesa. So this was also a choice that was made by Gdansk, the territories right up in the north. This is also the place of origin of the Solidarity Trade Union, but also the campaigns of Galicia. So this map of 2000 reveals another phantom border of the former territory of the Habsburg Kingdom of Galicia. And then this is clearly delimited by contrast to the former Russian territories of the Congress Poland or Congress Kingdom. You can see that the area around Warsaw, which was formerly dominated by Russia, and they were in favor of the candidate from the Polish Peasants' Party. And then you see the part of the Kingdom of Galicia in the southeast, and then the part which was dominated by Russia. And this is something which is clearly more pronounced as a difference in the vote. And here I would like to come to Polish sociologist and geographer Tomasz Zarzyński, and he was giving us a very detailed analysis of the electoral statistics, and he used the election results from the past 30 years. He noted that there was a shift in the political balance, a swing, once Poland joined NATO in 1999 and then the European Union in 2004. And these memberships were clearly connecting the Polish territory to the West. So he is explaining that with the shift in the geopolitical position of the country, which was very clearly moving towards the Western European sphere of influence, and the Polish society was then disconnecting itself with its communist, with its post-Soviet heritage. And this is also, this was then in shifting the political issues, and this was no longer the question of the post-Soviet past, which was at the center of the political debate, but rather the transfer of Western norms to society. And this was kind of at the center of the controversy, a deep controversy, which is still dominating the Polish society up to the very day. Up to 2000, 2004, we see that different political imaginaries were taking place along new fault lines, which were no longer to do with the socialist heritage, but with the modalities of a Europeanized, of a Western Europeanized future. So this political dispute is crystallizing itself, especially when it comes to the question of the position of the Catholic Church and religion in general in the public realm, the transformation of social and family norms, as well as the opening to one's own social and cultural self-concept. So the electorate is responding very differently to the challenges, societal challenges that play a role throughout its historical experience. And then I will explain with another example how the experience of societies articulates itself in the way it translates this experience into some questions which might arise in the context of the future of such societies. So we can see that the Russian empires, the German and the Austro-Hungarian empires, first of all, kind of acted as determinants, geohistorical determinants, kind of a reproduction of geocultural differences, but they were corresponding to something which was clearly more complex. And when we analyze these maps, we can see that there are strong fluctuations, instabilities, and the historical borders remain elusive. Some appear, some disappear, and this has to do with the variations and changes in the political national climate, but also the changes of the political topics that are very important at this specific point in time. So I would like to pass to the next topic, and I will show you how the imaginaries of the future play a role in this.
We will come back to a phantom border that goes through Romania. And I now come from back to my maps from the 19th century, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we have two provinces here, the old Moldavia and Wallachia. And you see this border here that's quite visible in these empires. I will only show you one part of it. You see here a map, and we'll zoom it in. That shows you the number of houses, of domestic households who don't have running water supply. And I will show you the differences between the two territories. It's very complicated to explain, but we'll try to make it clear. So we'll zoom in this picture, and how you can see here the map. You see here figures from 2011. We don't have more recent figures. That represents not the infrastructures that you would suppose, because main water access is should be part of the infrastructure, but the Romanian government was disinterested in providing it, so there's no policies in this respect. But the population drives wells, puts pumps in it, and install then bathrooms in their own houses. What you can see here is the differences between the strategies of the families, the ones who choose to equip themselves with running water pipes, and there you have regions where not many families who do that, and others where you have high numbers. Well, altogether, you see that only it's very low everywhere. Whatever the region, rural houses were only equipped to less than 15% at the time of 2002. And there are big differences right now because on the one hand, there's Transylvania and Banat and the west, where there's a higher level of equipment in comparison with the east and southeast. And there's a difference of up to 40% of equipment between the two regions. This geographical configuration is all the more interesting that it is very recent. At the time of the last census of 2002, before we didn't have any figures, and it's not an anecdote, this is what you see on a day-to-day basis in the villages. If you don't have your own water supply, you have to go to the well, you have to pump it up, you have to carry it back to your own house in the kitchen, in the bathrooms. And here you can see that you have the same phenomenon in Poland, the equipment rate of households with or without running water supply and bathrooms, etc. Here you can see the figures of 2002. And in the past, before, at the end of the 1980s, there was almost no running water pipes anywhere in the private households. And now you can see in one region, almost all households are equipped. So there's a real difference that is reinforcing themselves from the years 2000. It's a phantomic borders. It's personal research that I've done. You can see what really happens in the villages and ask yourself why in villages historically didn't choose to install their water equipment and then chose to do it or not. So I did a case studies, which we'll show right now. And which shows you some of the phantom borders in the band in the west and in the east. You have another village and you see in detail the differences between the two villages. Here you can see it in the east, west, you can have 79% of the households equipped with water supply, running water, and in the east only 4%, although all households have internet, etc., meaning they're not reticent to modernity. They accept modern concepts and with all its components, apart from water supply, let's say. But here, as far as access to water mains, there are clear differences. I now have to be schematic and very quick, but I want to show you this picture to see, show you what kind of differences you have. Structural differences that you can read and see in the villages themselves. Here you have an area view of the village in the west on the left-hand side, that is from the 18th century, very structured, etc. Very typical for the Banat regions. On the right-hand side, the eastern regions are more irregular, more historic. And the next, you have different types of buildings. In the western village, you have brick buildings from the 1950s, bigger buildings with at least 8 to 9 rooms, several families living in them. On the other hand, you have more modest houses where brick buildings were rare, or rather wooden houses, etc. So we have structures, infrastructures, and that are very different. And on here, in architecture, you can see also structural differences. You see, you have a Baroque architecture in the West, whereas in the Orthodox aesthetic in the Eastern village. So also a historical differences that has materialized and established in the physical landscape of these villages. What you can really recognize clearly are the villages of these villages interiorize this difference. In Otinia, the villagers say that they admire the villages in the neighboring region that are, let's say, more imposing, but the inhabitants in the western village of Banat say that they are proud of the robustness of their habitat, but also of the reputation, of hard work that they deliver, well done work that they do. And on both sides, the inhabitants point out and locate these materials and social facts. And with regard to a mental map that distinguishes Banat and identifies it in the collective representations of Romania as more Western and more civilized. For everyone, this is self-evident. And what is striking here as well is that this difference is experienced as a state of affairs, meaning the geographical imaginary that describes this former space, Habsburg space in the great narrative of progress and Western civilization. And when you ask about the habitat, they talk about their march towards modernization. Whereas on the other side, it's less coherent. Access to modernity is not lived as a continuity, but it's rather like a disruption with something that is so far perceived as medieval, old, obsolete. There are real differences between the perception, and I'll try to be synthetic, but we can say that in Banat, for inhabitants, they want to reconnect with history that has been interrupted with the unfortunate episode of Soviet domination. I want to reconnect with a geographical destiny of a region that they consider to be intrinsically modern, and that they always wanted to be modern and to develop. So they said, if we were not suffering from communism in the past, well, we would be as far as Germany, because this is for them the top that they could reach of modernism, etc. Meaning they share faith in their destiny, and disguise also their choices in investments, and they want to now come over and come over the past that's been built by their parents, grandparents, etc. So they overcome the past on the basis of the Central European heritage. On the other village, you find a totally different interpretation, and they don't refer to the heritage of Central Europe. They also want to become more modern. They have the same intentions, modernize, etc. But in order to do so, they feel that have to construct new buildings and disrupt. It's like a disruption, and it is. They have to construct new houses on the model of Western style villas. And we're dealing with two regimes of historicity. And we have two different geographical positions that have reflect two different regimes of historicity. So there are two logics, a historical logic. I showed you the different heritages, especially that find expressions in their materials, but also performative logic. Historical logic, recognizable in the differences between the material and the social spaces narrated from the past, and the performative logic in the sense that the multiple choices and daily statements of local actors constantly update a mental map that promises progress in material, social sphere, progress to Central Europe, and to overcome the backwardness of to Balkan Europe. So the inhabitants tend to conform to these destinies that the geographical imaginary assigns to the territories. So you can say that they update a sort of imagined future. Here you can see a modernization of a house in the west, and you see a house in the eastern regions where you build a totally new modern house inspired by a different Western model. So the inhabitants cannot imagine that they can simply renovate the existing house. It would be possible, technically speaking, but they don't associate modernity of, for say, of a bathroom to the heritage of the habitat that they consider to be archaic. So you can see this difference, and the results engage also different representations, different discourses. The inhabitants design phantoms according to different logics, a logic that follows their concrete, materialistic situations, but also prophecies that are mental maps of Europe that associate modernity with Central Europe and backwardness with Balkan Europe. And now I'll come to the heuristic interest of the concept of a phantom border. And I will try to give you an interpretation to tell you what's going on, what happens with the construction of these phantom borders so that you can work with this approach. So the concept of phantom borders, as we designed this with our team of historians and geographers, is set up based on dimensions that are also interlinked to each other. The first dimension is the dimension of the experience of societies. If we take up, for example, the categories of Reinhard Koselleck, so we can speak of what we call the space of experience. these are institutions, routines that are anchored also in materiality of places, including architectures in the space. That's the first dimension of the experience of society. So the second dimension is the dimension of the imaginary of societies that Koselleck called horizons of expectations that are very much marked by this mental maps that come also from somewhere else. There's, for example, the idea that Central Europe is in advance of Balkan Europe that is built up by intelligentsia, for example. The third dimension is the one of ordinary action, of multiple daily strategies of actors who choose to update or ignore certain elements of their experience, of the sense that they give it to their future, to these elements. So we have these three dimensions. So the performative experience of experiences. And this diagram frees phantom boundaries from their sole dependence on the past, and thus shows the links with the visions of the future. So it allows us also to understand the construction of cultural areas and frees us from the kind of rich mindset that keeps inhabitants prisoners of mentalities and structures established in the past. So it's not, nothing says that these mindsets are set, creates a space for the actors' capacities for interpretation and for the meaning that they give to their experience according to the vision, the current vision that they have of their future, of their current experience, of the moments. And it allows us also to consider their performative effectiveness. It allows them to be historicized and restores between the spaces of experience and the horizons of expectation of societies. And the last word, to establish a link with our doctoral school and on the question of borders that we're discussing. The concept of phantom borders seems to give us the possibility to establish a link with all kinds of borders, also in a metaphoric sense, to a constructed borders, also in the discourse. So to establish this link is a structural and structured establishment of borders in the past. I think it can be also referred to other objects, other situations, and that creates a link between the structural and structurized heritage and what comes from the imagination. Maybe you will see that there's also performative studies and the construction of gender studies, etc. And many borders are phantomatic, meaning in a way that they are imagined, a fruit of our social imagination, at the same time as the phantom, as ghosts. They are also incorporated in social behavior, where they are materialized. And on this, I finish on the last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our interpreters. And for me, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you in the framework of the summer school.